Hi, this is Dr. Nadine Rosechild-Sullivan, and I'm coming to you tonight to talk about social stratification by socioeconomic class status. So I want to talk a little bit about where we are right now as I record this night in America, and also our background and where we can hope to go sometime in the future to leave us on a note of hope and determination and forward motion. So just taking a moment to pause tonight, right now, tonight, June 28th, 2020. As I sit here tonight, the globe, the world has just crested 10 million, or is just about to crest the number of 10 million in regard to COVID cases, COVID-19. And also at this moment, as I sit here and speak to you tonight, the world has just had more than 500,000 people die from COVID-19. Also in this space, in the United States of America, we have diagnosed 2.5 million cases, more than 2.5 million cases. And those are those that we've diagnosed. It's been something where we couldn't get testing unless we were sick enough often to be being admitted to a hospital, or at least to have gone to a hospital and then being sent home to hopefully recover at home. But 2.5 million diagnosed cases, when it hasn't been something we could just go get because we had a number of symptoms, and many symptomatic people and asymptomatic people have been unable to get tests. Also tonight, as I sit here, over 125,000 people have died in the United States of coronavirus. And so just sitting in that space, it's also really important to think about the fact that this pandemic, global as it is, has really highlighted the fractures in our own United States socioeconomic class system. It has highlighted real differences between the social classes, the economic classes. So as a sociologist, I'm speaking tonight about socioeconomic class status, or something sometimes abbreviated to SES. In thinking about that, we need to think about what has been shown up through the fracturing that has become apparent in this pandemic. Part of what has become apparent, as right now also tonight, over 40 million Americans have gone on unemployment, have needed to file claims to use their unemployment insurance. And let me emphasize that word, insurance. It is not an entitlement. It is an insurance that we have paid for in every paycheck that has been, if we got a 1099 form, then we made it up to the IRS as our taxes were done that year. And if we were getting a W-2 form or other form like that from an employer, we have paid Social Security insurance and we have paid unemployment insurance across our working lifespans as American citizens. We pay those. They are taken out. They are withheld. They are withholdings from our paychecks, and they are insurance premiums that we're paying. At least that's how we were told they were. We were not told that they were given to us undeservedly, but instead earned. So taking this, and they're also based, what we get in either of those settings is also based on what we've been earning. So if we are unemployed, the amount of money we get through unemployment comes to us based on the kind of income we've been earning. And if we end up on Social Security, whether Social Security disability or later in life on, collecting our Social Security in our retirement years, those also have the amount of money we are getting in those payments is based on what we've been earning, which is therefore also then based on what we've been paying in across time as our insurance premium. One of the things that's been shown to be fractured by this pandemic has been our essential workers are overwhelmingly underpaid. So most of us been sheltering in place at some level. Some of our states have been opening up, not opening up, whatever, but somewhere for, me sitting here in Pennsylvania, working in New Jersey and South Jersey, I began to quarantine on March 13th, 2020, and to stay home, to stay, as much as possible away from other human beings, to only go around them, wearing a mask, being very conscious of hand hygiene and physical distancing of 6 feet or more when being around them. But in that, ability to stay home and to continue to be employed, to continue to teach remotely, I have felt enormously grateful to happen to be in those shoes at this moment in time in my life. There have been other moments of time in my life when I and my ex-husband together when we faced his unemployment time and time again, and situations in which, I've been in the other side of this, right, where people couldn't continue to be paid working from home. But I have been blessed to be one of the fortunate ones to be working from home through this window of time. But many of the people who've needed to be out there, so certainly our doctors and nurses are among our primary essential workers that have needed to be out there. And some doctors and some nurses are paid somewhat well. It entirely depends on the specialty and the field, and there's all sorts of differentials that make, decide who is well paid, who's not well paid. Um, Certainly, generally speaking, surgeons may get more than family doctors or primary care physicians as far as annual earnings go. There are some kinds of nurses, maybe the nurse who works in the oncology ward is being paid very differently, certainly than the nurse with a bachelor's degree versus the nurse without a bachelor's degree, the RN, but without a bachelor's, or those who are other kinds of nurses, those who are licensed, LPNs, or who are certified nursing assistants or nurses' aides of whatever kind, home health care workers, all very differently paid, and yet all very, very essential in this crisis. We've needed them as a population, the mass of humanity. We have needed them in this space and time. Also, there are those who are our first responders, those who are emergency medical technicians and ambulance drivers and crew, and those who are our firemen, those who are our police officers, our good police officers. We've needed and they're paid differently as well. There are different ways in which different people in those settings are paid differently, and yet many of them very, very much on the front lines, very much exposed to the possibility of contracting COVID-19 through all of this window of time. So we've seen those fractures. Other essential workers that are really underpaid have been our grocery store workers. And we know we can say thank you. We can, clap and cheer for our doctors and nurses, or have balloon parades, or, we can say thank you, hopefully wear our mask and say thank you to the grocery store worker and respect their need to stay safe, either because they themselves may have some health complications, or family members may, or, whatever is going on for them, or just, nobody wants this, right? Nobody needs it. Nobody wants to feel sick if they don't need to. So we should all be being kind and considerate to one another. And my wearing a mask is my showing respect for the other as a human being who doesn't want to catch it. And if I don't have it, if that's true, and I actually don't have it, I'm still showing my respect, because they do not know if I was tested this morning, which actually, I've not been in a position to be able to be tested, and neither have almost any of us. But in that space, our grocery store workers, very underpaid, and many of their levels of, within our grocery store chains, or those who have continued to deliver food through this pandemic, have been delivering food, really underpaid workers, those who trying to keep a restaurant afloat. Many restaurants have stayed open for takeout or for curbside pickup or for delivery, and all of that space very underpaid. Those who have been delivering for apps like Uber Eats, or any of the others, Grubhub, or any of the others, which some of us can put into our cell phone or put onto our computer and send for some food to be delivered to our door. Often very, very underpaid workers. I was occasionally using an app to order some groceries before all of this. The ability of that app to fill my order evaporated early in this. Whether or not it's come back, I don't know, but those people also not very well paid, really needing to deliver a lot of grocery orders within an hour to be able to have enough money to, even begin to make ends meet, to begin to pay their rents, pay their own mortgages, pay for their own food and health insurance, and all the things that are incumbent upon us as working adults in this culture. So our essential workers, largely, large numbers of them not able to stay home, and not often, many of them not able to file for unemployment. The doctors and nurses we needed to keep working, but also, the Uber Eats driver, the Lyft driver, all of those people end up in a space where, a lot of the way they're paid as a gig worker working as an individual contractor for that company, the way it's structured for them, they've not been able to file for unemployment. And hence, whatever their health status and whatever the health status of those in their households and whatever their likelihood of exposure wherever they've lived as their region of the country and the numbers that have been existent in that space at that time, many of them have needed to keep working in order to just not die, right? Not starve to death, not get kicked out in the street and become homeless, which is a really bad time to end up homeless. So speaking of the homeless, we have these structures in our society. Clearly, we do have a class of person who is unpaid and unhoused, right? So we have the homeless in the United States, and people are homeless for a number of reasons. Some people are homeless because of psychiatric issues and whatever is happening with them medically, whatever's happening in regard to their meds or their not meds, and whatever is happening with their families, sometimes for addiction purposes, sometimes because, they either never had the family that could take them in, or the family that could take them in, feels like they're enabling them, or whatever that space is. And, and they are, or however that goes down for individuals. There are other blocks of people in our homeless population as well. Not everybody is in that space. There's a factor called the feminization of poverty that happens to large numbers of women in divorce. And so overwhelmingly, and this is a grand statistic, so it's certainly not true for every case, and you may anecdotally know individuals for whom this is not true, but overwhelmingly, speaking as a sociologist, we study people groups, right? Overwhelmingly, in the United States, when a woman is divorced, her income goes down dramatically. She loses the male wage of her, I'm presuming here, her heterosexuality. In a heterosexual couple, when there's a divorce, the woman loses that male wage. And overwhelmingly, the male income is suddenly, it goes up. His expendable cash goes up in the first year and the first 5 years after a divorce, because even if he's paying child support and alimony, oftentimes he's paying less of the overhead. And the court will not generally, at least in my discussion with a lawyer back in the day, will not put him in a place where he can't keep a roof over his own head. And so all of how that plays out. So there are homeless women with their children who end up homeless because of a divorce or because of an unemployment issue like what's going on now, and not having a male partner with a male wage, or a partner with a second wage, a second income. So we've got the homeless. If we go back to the 1920s in the United States, we hear about the Roaring 20s, but they roared only for those who were in a certain very privileged, very upper class status. In the US, coming up into the 1920s, we essentially had two classes in the United States: the very wealthy and the working poor, or the working class people, some of whom, managed to find a way to own a house, and many of whom did not. But we had a great class divide. We did not have a middle class in the United States as we're coming into the 1920s and into the 1930s. So in the 1930s, when the Depression hits, and some of the rich, some of the wealthy are jumping out of New York City skyscrapers because the stock market has crashed. We've heard those stories. I know of no one, but wasn't here then. But as that is happening, overwhelmingly across the nation, the mass of people are working class or relatively poor, and so are, struggling simply to get by. And we've seen those pictures of those food lines, of people waiting in line, in the soup lines, of people, just absolutely driven to destitution. In that space, it does not look that different than some of the lines of cars waiting for money, for food from food banks around this country, but even in Texas, and a month and more ago, just the way the unemployment has driven people to not be able to, even necessarily afford their own food, depending on what was happening for them with unemployment. Could they file or not file? How much had they been earning? What kind of unemployment check were they getting? All of those factors that play in, and what kind of, food did they have? So there is that space. Also in the Great Depression, there is just that, there's a class of people that just begin to become itinerant. There are men, the stories of the hobos who would hop the trains and go from place to place to place looking for day work, looking for anyone who would hire them to sweep or to mow or to do anything they could do for, that day's food. Like our homeless who sometimes hold up a sign on a street in Philadelphia saying, "We'll work for food," we'll work, just that kind of needing subsistence, needing to just find enough to eat for the day, maybe a roof or over one's head or a bridge to sleep under for the night. And so that level of poverty and destitution through the 1930s. As we come into the 1940s, the economy begins to, air quotes, recover based on war production, right? So everything goes into gear to produce, planes and bombs and guns and tanks and all of those things, and to transport them to Europe and to the Pacific for, to the theaters of war. And women are enticed out of their homes and into the factories to fill the munitions factories, to fill the spots that the men have left and gone off into the service. And, so there's this wholesome thing, but there's some income, but there's also heavy rationing during World War II, right? There's limitations on how much cheese or milk or chocolate or nylons, stockings or whatever that any person, any family can get a hold of. So there's all of that. And then as we come out of World War II, our nation creates a middle class. First, it intentionally creates a very white middle class. So there are absolutely overt racist rules and regulations written into these programs at first, and then they get modified across time. But, there had already been in the 1930s, as part of the response to the Great Depression, not only has FDR looked to make jobs through the Works Project Administration, the WPA, but he also, there's put into place the Social Security system. There's put into place the idea of, those unemployment, the idea of something to be there for people in their old age, for people in extreme poverty. So there's a little bit of the creation of a social safety net that begins in the 1930s. That it's developed further from the end of World War II through, let's say, the next approximate 20 years. So we're going to say approximately 45 to 65, 68, somewhere in there. We have this creation of different things that are meant to revive the economy, switch us from a war economy to a post-war economy, and also, to give jobs to the returning veterans. So part is a propaganda campaign and meant to entice women back out of the factories, because some women didn't mind earning their own wages, and they're now having some sort of career outside the home. They're enticed back into the home. A lot of the commercials, the television shows, everything goes into high gear to give this image of a woman whose life is entirely fulfilled by being a wife, by being a mother, by being a domestic worker in her home, by being a domestic goddess whose home sparkles. And so there's the creation of a lot of home appliances. There is federal monies. There are federal monies put toward highway production and meant to undergird the automobile industry. And with that highway production, this money that is designated toward the clearance of slums, and so this redlining of Black and Latino neighborhoods, and this removal of entire neighborhoods, and this building of what was supposed to be affordable housing, but does not necessarily, it was often stadiums and housing for the rich. There's these programs that go into play in the mid-20th century and with it, FHA and the Veterans Administration, so Federal Housing Authority and Veterans Administration loans that offer home ownership, and we talked about this in a different video, but that offer home ownership to white families in the suburbs for single family dwellings. And that it works as a form of affirmative action, and it begins to create a white middle class, because suddenly now the white person can own a home in the suburbs, can afford, because the home costs less than their other apartment or their former home in the city. They are getting such a good deal on this mortgage. It's such a low price for the house and such a low interest rate that they can then afford to purchase a car, and they can afford to motor the generally at this point, because of this selling of this domestic ideology for women, the man gets in the car in the morning, motors on off on those highways that are being built down back into the city to his day job, and back home at night to the wife in the suburbs who's waiting in her shirt dress with her apron on, who has cooked his meal and meets him at the door with his pipe and slippers, and, and then serves him his dinner before she serves the children, and then, puts the food away, does the dishes in her new dishwashing appliance, and, he is waited on hand and foot, and they have this lovely little, 3-bedroom home, 1.5 baths, little lot in the suburbs, and she talks across the backyard fence to her neighbors. Actually, the women in those neighborhoods, I grew up in one of those neighborhoods, and I can say with assurance that there was a woman installed in every house I passed on my mile-long walk to school, to and from school every day. There was a woman in each of those suburban houses who was installed in that house just as firmly as the refrigerator and the dishwasher, because she was an appliance in that house. She never left that house. My own mother left the house in her multiple childbearing. She left the house every Sunday when my father brought the single car that we owned, and we all piled into the back of the car, and my mother into the passenger seat, holding the youngest babies. We didn't have car seats back in those days, or seatbelts, and we just tumbled around in the back of a station wagon, 12 of us, except for the baby in her arms, and we drove to church a mile away near the school that I walked to, and we went to church, and we went home, where she then made Sunday afternoon dinner, and and that was her sole outing for the week. My best friend's mother, as I grew up, actually literally, for the number of years that I observed her, and I was, in that household, in that family quite actively for about 12 years, but beginning at the time of about 11 years old, as I began to be a part of my best friend's family and be received as a second daughter, and to call their mother mom, though my mom didn't know that. But anyway, as I also called her mom, and she was on the walk home from school, stopped there every afternoon, spent a lot of weekends, spent a lot of time in that house across the years, and literally her mother never left that house. She didn't do much over the backyard fence talking either, but literally she didn't leave that house from summer to summer. There absolutely, she did not go to church. Her daughter was sent to meet me and walk to church with me often. Her son was also sent to go walk himself to church. We were sent to walk to school and back again. She didn't leave the house. Groceries were delivered, bread and milk were delivered by different people. You called up and placed your grocery order, and the grocer had it delivered. And she was installed in that house. She did once a year in the summer. They did leave to go visit family in other states, and they would be gone for about 2 weeks and leave the house unlocked, and I'd go sit in there and not hit the whiskey sour mix. But there was just that space in her life where she lived there, installed in that house. And these were the suburbs, but it created a middle class life. And so in that space, there was a fair amount of ease and wealth. There was a time that I recall in which there was not a lot of need for, there wasn't too much worry about how much the electric bill cost, or trying to keep it low, or trying to wear sweaters. And, there was that space. And so there's just this creation of the middle class in the middle 20th century that happens. And it's largely a white middle class. Eventually, Black families also become able to apply for VA loans or FHA housing loans, begin to move into that neighborhood as well. But there is a reason, and I read the quote by Stephen Craig Wilder, a historian, who asked the question, why is there a Black urban core in every industrial city in the United States? And the answer is, he says, public policy. And so, it's almost essentially a quote from him. So there's this creation of the middle class that happens in the mid-20th century. But with it, a number of things also go into effect that are affecting us still. So there is, prior to this window, there's the immigrant dream of coming to America, right? There's the Emma Lazarus poem on the base of the Statue of Liberty, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to be free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, your hungry tempest tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. The immigrant comes with the urgency, to be able to feed their family, to do better, to build a better life for themselves, for their children, to lay up for retirement, to pull together some sort of family wealth, to create something for themselves, their children, that entire something, maybe often sending money back to the home country to relatives that they've had to leave behind. Part of the, dream at various points in time have been to bring over your family, to help bring some of your cousins and sisters and brothers and mother and father and whatever, to bring people here. Some people have left their spouses and children behind, and then the effort to bring them here. So that sort of piece, there's that American dream, right? That immigrant American dream for a better life. There's another American dream, that home ownership dream, that really begins to be sold there at the end of World War II. That home ownership dream that is like, here is, you want to get a house. You want to be able to own your own home, not just rent, not just live in the city in an apartment, take public transportation, but you want this car and you want this house. You want this single family dwelling in the suburbs kind of dream. But by the time we begin to come into the late 70s, things are shifting again in the United States, and they begin to shift as we enter 1980 and the election of Ronald Reagan. There begins to be a different dream that's sold. So in that space, Johnson has also put into play some social programs in the 1960-ish era where, there's the idea of America can afford to give, we can put in programs like WIC and give cheese and milk and formula to young children to make sure they have enough protein for their brains to develop well, and aid for families with dependent children. So AF, Aid for Families Dependent Children, AFDC, gets put into place as, something that's there only for mothers with children too young for school, preschool age children, right? And there's some cash assistance, there's some food stamps that go in there, there's some sort of healthcare coverage for those children, because you actually can't have a baby and then hang it on a hook and go to work and come home and find it healthy and alive and then go back to tending it and then hang it on a hook the next morning and go off to work for 8-10 hours, come home. And that's just not, young children must be watched every moment of every day and all night long, or they may not survive, right? So they are entirely dependent beings. They remain very, very, very dependent. Latchkeyness is very, very dangerous, even at first or second grade level. Really, a child should be, and I'm speaking from something of a position of privilege, but to really be safe, most children should be 10 or 12 or 13 years old before they're being left home alone. I did begin to babysit other people's children at about that age. I would not have been any good being left home alone overnight at that age. But so there's this idea, there's a reason to help mothers with children too young, that don't have any family support, that don't have whatever, that don't have a partner that is allowing someone to stay at home, and that don't have the money for daycare. So there's a little bit of daycare assistance offered in some of these programs, but they're essentially cut away. And they're pared down to next to nothing now. So for just a moment, let me disabuse you of the idea that there's actually any welfare really left in the United States. If you make really, really, really next to nothing, you might still get some daycare assistance. If you make next to nothing, you might get some food stamps, though there was a big cut to food stamps this past Christmas 2019 by the current occupant of the White House. And there are plans to cut that budget much further if someone is reelected and that budget were to go through. The budget that has been proposed for 2021 would decimate Social Security as well, and Medicaid and Medicare and whatever. But what remains right now as I speak to you at this moment is less than $200, about $196 a month in cash assistance that may be available to some people with children based on having those children that need care, and some amount of food stamps maybe, and not a lot. I know we've all heard about the person who sold their food stamps for enough money to go buy some drugs, but they were, this was not a big transaction because there's not a lot of money involved in the food stamps. And so, what's there is a little bit of that, and a little bit, at least in my state, a little bit of health care for children if you're that kind of poor. and Medicaid potentially. So, maybe a little bit of some healthcare coverage. But what begins to happen, so those social programs were there, they were gutted. Most of them were severely gutted at the end of the 90s by a guy named Newt Gingrich and signed, I guess at that point in time, by Bill Clinton. I believe that's who was president then. But, that was gutted badly at the end of the 90s. And so there's not really much of that left. But what has been there has been these homes that white families got to purchase. And then as we're coming into the end of the 70s, the early 80s, working class jobs are being sent out of cities, off into the suburbs. You can see it if you drive through North and West Philadelphia and you see the abandoned factories with the insulation flapping out in the breeze out of the broken glass windows. Those were vibrant job sites, and they moved offshore. So corporations were given tax breaks by the Reagan administration and its policies that allowed them to make more money on their product if they actually manufactured it elsewhere and didn't pay the American worker a living wage, or didn't pay the American worker any sort of vacation or retirement or pension or any of that. But what's happened here at this window in time in the late 40s, early 50s is healthcare coverage has become attached to one's employer. So prior, there is no healthcare coverage. When my father first became a primary care physician, and for most of my memory of most of the years that he worked in his office practice, he simply took cash payments. And I remember when he charged as little as $10 a visit, right? And so you went to your kid had a cold, you called my father, you went to his office, you gave him $10, you had 15 minutes, he treated your kid, wrote a prescription, sent you home. And if you couldn't afford to pay the $10, he kept a little running tab on these little cards, and he'd mail you an invoice at the end of the month, and hopefully you'd catch up. If you never caught up, eventually he'd write you off as a bad patient. If you sort of did your best, then he would work with you, and that's how it went. There was, at that point in time, Blue Cross had come into existence attached to people's jobs, and it was there for major medical. It was there for if you were hospitalized. It was there for when you needed the surgeon, not the primary care doctor. And so that's phase. But what begins to happen as these jobs are going offshore is also in the 1980s, the idea of well visits come in. And so what begins to happen is there's this other form of insurance that begins to come where your insurer now pays for your regular doctor's visit. Maybe there's a lot more prescription drugs being written, their prices are going up. And so all of that goes up. And what was a $10 office visit with my father becomes an $80 office visit because he has to hire someone to fill out the paperwork. And then when they do fill out the paperwork and they bill the insurer that that is your employer has contracted with, then, maybe he's lucky if he gets back $30 and he gets to give, some of that to the person who is his billing worker, and he's got all this overhead. And so all that stuff changes and shifts in that place. And at that time, as we're losing a lot of our employment, a lot of our working class and lower middle class employment, and as we're having these increased levels of healthcare insurance coverage that should be attached to our jobs, but might not be, and involve a lot of co-pays and involve a lot of surprise bills later because this or that is out of network and HMOs are coming to existence. All this stuff is happening in the 1980s, and on television. The television shows are selling us all a new American dream. Only now this American dream is couched in shows like Dallas and Dynasty and something called Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. And we're sitting down on Biography to watch the life of Andrew Carnegie, and we're watching, and he's being praised, and we're looking at the opulence of his mansion, and we're all being sold this idea that we can become part of that class, that we don't really want them to be taxed in any sort of way. Well, the Reagan administration is reducing the taxes on the rich because really wealthy people used to pay, a similar proportion of taxes. They used to pay some income tax, but things are being taken away and they're being reframed, and inheritance tax, if you or I as a middle class or working class person have a relative who dies and leaves us something, it's not our spouse, it's somebody else, then we have to pay
state inheritance tax. If they left us a lot, we'd have to pay federal inheritance tax. But when the really, really wealthy have to pay it, suddenly it's a death tax. And it gets renamed, right? And it gets respun, and no middle-class person wants to see anybody have to pay a death tax. And we begin to fight, the middle class, the mass of Americans begin to resist taxing the wealthy because it's being respun. There's a PR spin done on it. And we're all thinking we can become Andrew Carnegie. And none of us are looking at the fact that Andrew Carnegie and others like him built their wealth on absolutely the lives and the deaths of their workers, that they absolutely had these unsafe places for people to work, and they had, just countless deaths per year, and and they underpaid them, and they died of all sorts of things like black lung. And, my ex-father-in-law died having worked at Fairless Hills, at the Fairless Hills U.S. Steel plant from the end of World War II through to his death at age 60. And he died just days after his 60th birthday from the emphysema that his job had caused. He had spent those decades standing above something called open hearth, which was this huge open smelting furnace, to melt steel. And he was throwing bags of chemical in with no protective gear, exposed to the heat and exposed to the powders and the dusts of the chemicals. My ex, he got it, and so my father-in-law got my ex a job at the steel mill. And when he was working in that steel mill, he would go to work with a brand new pair of white socks, and white tube socks. And when he came home that first day, they were absolutely permanently dyed red from the iron ore dust that was simply there everywhere that he went. And with that as well, with that entire space of what that was, his clothing smelled so bad that, if we tried to wash, one time we washed it in a laundry room area in an apartment building we lived in, and the woman who lived in the apartment above called the fire department because she thought her unit was on, she thought something in the building was on fire because of the egregious smell of my husband's laundry from the steel mill, right? So his father just, died of the lung ailment caused by that job. But, there were people who got wealthy, who got rich off of that. And so, but we're all being sold, you can become this. There's been a song in much more recent days than that called I Want to Be was it Billionaire? And it's so effing bad, right? I mean, the tune, right? I want to be a billionaire. So that's something we all wanted to become part of that. If you actually want to see what that looks like, there are there's one I really love, but there are two movies made by the heir to the Johnson & Johnson fortune, a man by the name of Jamie Johnson, Jamie. In 2003, he made a movie called Born Rich, which you can find on Amazon. And in 2019, he made a movie, the one I prefer, I think it's much better, called The 1%. And you can buy that one on YouTube for $5.29 at the time of this recording. But The 1%, if you really look at Jamie Johnson's documentaries about what is actually the 1%. There is a wealthy class that has been empowered by these Reagan era and later policies of the federal government to not tax the wealthy, that has allowed CEO wages to go from about 40 times more than their average employee to hundreds of times more than their average employee, that has allowed this creation of multi-millionaires and billionaires, and this, rise of this American oligarchy, which, Jamie Johnson clearly documents in this space. So we had the wealthy. I mean, in the era of Carnegie was that, right? The Rockefellers were that. There were families that got, a handful of families that got extremely wealthy in the industrial era in the late 1800s, early 1900s in America, building that. But then there's those who have risen into that class status, that socioeconomic class status, through the policies that have been in effect for the last 40, 50 years. And in looking at that, we need to recognize that in sociological conflict theory, there's this idea of, conflict between classes, between the socioeconomic class statuses. There is an empowered minority class that we call the 1%. You hear about the 1% and the 99%. That terminology first began to be used a lot around the beginning of the Occupy movement. But this 1% of the population that are so empowered, Marx would have called them the bourgeoisie and called the working people the proletariat. The proletariat are a majority and overwhelmed. We really are the 99%. Like, that's not an exaggeration. There's a couple of hundred families in the 1%. And the rest of us are all in this 99%. And so even if you know somebody who's doing really well, somebody, if you have a doctor and a lawyer, even if you're making 170,000 a year, 300,000 a year, that is not in the 1%. Those in the 1% are the super wealthy, right? And that has been empowered by government policy. But those who are there are those, so the idea is there are those who own the means of production, like Carnegie owning the steel mills or the shipping lines or whatever it was Carnegie owned, or whoever owned US Steel, all of that. There's the people who own the mines and who own the factories and who own where things were produced, who own the plantations, right? The super wealthy, the large plantation owners of the South. So this empowered minority, a small percentage of the people who are the owners of the means of production, and in that case also including human labor. Some people have argued about those who would have worked before the American labor movement, those who worked in the sweatshops and the factories and the mines of the late 1800s, early 1900s, were a kind of a wage slave. They were making so little. They were not slaves because they were paid something, but you could have one of those jobs and your house was owned by, you could have a mine job, your house is owned by the mine, you have to buy your food at the mine store, everything you owe the mine store, all of your money to pay back for everything you bought. You go on strike, they kick you out of your house because the mine owns it. So, not a lot of freedom there. And then you're told you're in debt. You're always in debt. So you can't, there's this, this idea that if you are indebted to someone, they own you then, and you can't get away from them. So all of that. So there are those who own the means of production, and then there are those who are paid for their labor or fed for their labor or something. But there are those with the means of production and those who are doing the producing for either really bad wages, at least by comparison, or who are doing the producing for no wages, if we're actually talking a system of slavery. And there is more slavery in the globe right now, which is not at all to discount the race-based slavery of the American South or North, because Pennsylvania was the first state to outlaw slavery, but New York did not manumit its slaves until, I believe I remember correctly, it was 1827. And then depending on your age and your gender, if you were younger and male, then you had to work a certain number more years until you were free. So there were enslaved African slaves in New York State almost right up to the outbreak of the Civil War, like kissing the Civil War. Not 1860, but close, right? Really, really close. And also the industry of the North was built in large measure on Southern slavery. So the sweatshops were producing clothing, and they're underpaying the little Italian and Jewish and Irish girls. But while they're doing that and this backbreaking, horrific work conditions, while that is happening, what they're making that clothing out of is Southern cotton that's been grown on the backs of slaves, or harvested at the hands of slaves for no money. So that whole something. But right now, globally, there's the sale of human beings, both as sex slaves, which to me is one of the most horrific things one can possibly imagine, having to service a large number of people per day that are not of one's choosing in any way. I will stop before I go into how bad that imagination can be, or the reality can be. But also, there are wage slaves. There are slaves for labor or they're not wage. There are slaves for labor around the globe, people who they and even their families are actually held in bondage through this mechanism of debt, not paid, not free, don't have their papers, can't take their passport, their birth certificate and leave, are actually held under rifle fire, producing many of the things we don't know where the stuff we wear or we buy comes from. And much, much slavery is part of the foods that we eat, the system of the production of the food offshore from here, and the system of the clothing and our electronics, and just, we just overwhelming if we look at it globally. But back to America, I want to look again. I want to just briefly close with these ideas. So one is that our class statuses, we like to think of them as permeable. We like to think of the token person who made it through into that space. And certainly there are the individuals who make so much money they cross over, right? There's the Oprah who makes all sorts of money and becomes one of the very wealthy. There are, I don't actually know what Jeff Bezos started out with for a living, for his income early in his life, but there are people who didn't have a lot who made it big in tech, or who did whatever, found a way to get stuff delivered to your door in 24 or 48 hours for, free shipping or whatever, and made this money. So there's that, but there's also ways in which the new rich never cross into real fellowship with the old rich, because there are patterns and preferences of aesthetics that relate to class status as well. So if I were to suddenly have enough money and the right dress and be allowed to begin to hobnob with the super wealthy in some social setting, they would immediately place me for being middle class, maybe upper middle class. We can argue about my class background with my father's being a physician, but on the other hand, his having 12 living children and all of what that did and didn't mean in my background. But there are differences in taste, in music and dress and food and ways of speaking that show, and that would cause us to be read by the super wealthy as not one of their own. So there's that. There's also the fact of the matter that most of the people in the United States don't make that much money. So I'll end with these thoughts, as quickly as I can. There's an exercise I sometimes do if I have a classroom face-to-face, where I take the US Census data and I take the median income, the middle figure of so in the US Census data, we don't report that upper 5% because it just it makes the bell curve go all kinds of wonky. So we report 95% of the household income in the United States and break it into fifths, break it into quintiles. And if at the middle of it all, the middle of the middle, so of the third quintile in the middle of it, the household income I looked at a census for 2015 to 2018, at census data for their median household income, that's every working adult in a household. That includes a husband and a wife and a wife, a husband and a husband. It includes, grandmom and grandpop and child, and whatever. It includes all working, your aunt and uncle live with you. It includes all working adults in a household. $60,000 is the median household income in the United States. For an individual, that median is $32,000. Right, so we're still running Census 2020. Don't have that data yet. Not going to look good after what coronavirus is doing to us. But so taking these stats from 2015, 2018, 60,000 for a household, 32,000 for an individual income. If we take that, so I'll have a class take that. Maybe at the 95th percentile, somebody's making 170,000. It is different by race, right? So white or all may be there because white people are still a majority in the United States. But when we divide it out by race, it might come down from 170,000 at the 95th percentile to 130,000 if you're Black, or the median income, if it's 60,000 for all and 60,000 for white, it might be more like 45,000 for Black and 32,000 if you're Latino. So the numbers there, and you're not holding me to those, because I know the 60,000, you can hold me to that, and you can hold me to the 32. I did not look up all the rest of the state statistics, but I did back in 2010 and 2015. So those are older numbers. But holding that idea, I will have a class take the 60,000 and I will give them a working couple, right? Husband and husband, wife and wife, husband and wife, two working adults in this household with two teenagers that they must feed. I usually make them sons, a little gendered of me, assuming the boys are going to eat a little more. May not happen. But I have this couple. This is a marital couple, so they need a bedroom door that closes. So the two boys are either sleeping in the living room in the 1-bedroom apartment, or the two boys, they have to have a 2-bedroom. And then I begin to class, I have the class take 1/3 off the top of that for the withholdings from their paychecks, right? So we're withholding the Social Security, the unemployment, their income tax, their state tax, their city wage tax, all the stuff that's coming out of our paychecks, and taking that and holding that out, right? So then, having taken 60,000, we then taking 1/3 off, right? We're taking what remains, and I begin to have the class spend it. So we then begin to decide, where can this family live? You know, but we want them living somewhere safe. They've got teenage boys. So when we're having a discussion, can they own a car, not own a car? Can they have a car with a loan? Can they have, how are they paying the auto insurance? By the time we get through the discussion, generally, they're living in the best neighborhood in the city they can afford. They're taking public transportation. The boys in the city of Philadelphia, last time I checked, the boys could get a Cinderella bus pass. The school district would give you a pass. It's good till I think 6 p.m. and it's not good on weekends, but it allows you to take the bus to and from school. The couple has to, we decide they can't own a car, but generally speaking, this has gone this way most of the time. The couple ends up with they need 2 monthly trans passes so they can get to and from their jobs. And then we begin to talk about how much they're spending on groceries, whether or not they can ever order a pizza, and by the time we break it all down, they have food. They're living on a lot of ramen noodles, but they got to buy some meat once in a while, or some protein once in a while for their sons. We're moving that forward. They do not have internet in their house. They can't afford it. They end up on a cheaper cell phone plan, like, not to plug them, but like Metro PCS, and they got 4 phones for $100, and they're doing their homework on their cell phone and using their cell phone as internet. And they don't have money they don't have a clothing budget. They have no co-pays for medical insurance. They've got none of the above, right? So that's the reality for the median household income in the United States. And our healthcare is attached to those jobs. We have monthly payments that there's parts of our check being held out for our healthcare because the employer's not paying for it all, right? We're just getting a group rate because we're getting it through the employer. And the employer is paying something, but we're paying something. So there's all of that. So as you move that forward, we're seeing again these fractures, right? We're seeing right now, heard a horror story. Somebody, went into the hospital because of the coronavirus, ended up in the ICU for a prolonged period of time. I forget right now if the story was 30 days or 50 days or whatever. But, get home from the hospital, the bills start coming in the mail. People are getting bills for $1 million. People who've managed to survive, who were in ICU on a ventilator, who are having to deal with the PTSD of there's trauma induced in that because people have been put into comas to allow the intubation and allow them not to fight the vent. And then they're in and out of sort of nightmarish states, and the nurses look like monsters, and, and they're coming home with some issues. And yet with all of this, there's these bills showing up. And so, it's showing the fractures. And now as 40 million plus Americans are unemployed, what does that mean when they tell you, that you can, I forget right now, I'm spacing on the name of what it is you can pay for when your health insurance runs out from your employer, but it's always too much. It's always, 3 or 4 times what you were paying with your employer. And so people end up not often being able to do that. And then, right now, there's a renewed attack on the healthcare marketplace, which right now, if you're unemployed, you can go onto healthcare.gov. And you can say you've had, even though it's not the open enrollment window, you've just had this change in your job status, and you can apply. And some people, because you're now making next to nothing on unemployment, you may be able to be paying a very, very small amount to get onto the healthcare marketplace, Obamacare insurance. And it depends a lot on your state, because some states bought in and some states didn't buy in to Medicaid parts of the Obamacare. So it's very, very different. The experience of the Affordable Care Act has been different state to state. Thankfully in Pennsylvania, it's been pretty good. And so if you are in PA or Jersey, you should be okay doing that. Elsewhere, I know in Georgia, it's not so good. But whatever that looks like for you, think about what this means. We need health insurance that is not attached to our jobs. So where do we go from here? We're going to all weather this storm. Overwhelmingly, there will be more deaths, unfortunately, but overwhelmingly, most of us will find ourselves still embodied when the pandemic has worn itself out and passed over. I'm taking the model of the 1918 flu pandemic, and I am assuring my own heart and mind with it that, that with the opportunity to wear some masks, to do as much physical distancing as you find possible, to do as much hand hygiene and consciousness as possible, that you've got a good chance of making it through to the other side. And that, that swept through in 3 waves over a year and a half to almost 2 years time. And then a number of things happened. Most of the people who survived then had some level of immunity to it. It couldn't jump from host to host as well. And at some event, it's still out there in the virus streams, but it devolved into something potentially less deadly and something, that we've all managed to now live with. However, in that time, it killed 50 to 100 million people around the globe. We've already hit 500,000 around the globe right now with this one. So in the next year and a half, somewhere this will be over. We'll all be moving it back out into what used to be more natural life. We'll be finding new ways forward. But what do we do? One, let me encourage you to vote your civil rights and the civil rights of your neighbor and the civil rights of others who are positioned perhaps somewhat differently than you in regard to maybe race, ethnicity, native born status, or whatever. But, be thinking about the fact that, very few of us are part of that 1%. And so us buying the dream that we're someday going to, that we're someday going to enter that class status and therefore fighting for them not to have to pay taxes, not really making a whole lot of sense, right? So there needs to be some redistribution, not of like, give me the money somebody else made, but the redistribution would happen by fairly taxing those who are in the super rich. And I know they've got ways to hide it. So I'm not going to, not going there. Elizabeth Warren knows how to do that. She actually does, whether you're Democrat or Republican. The woman is smart. The woman is economically smart. The woman is a professor. The woman knows what she's talking about and would know how to do that and how to get that done. We need to think about organized collective action. Right now, there are right to work laws that have been passed or justified. I forget if it was a Supreme Court decision, but that what they've called right to work is actually a misnomer. It's misnamed. It is something that then forbids you to organize and to unionize and to fight for your collective rights. Believe me, unions can make a difference. The labor movement, go look up the history of the labor movement. It is what took absolute sweatshop, death trap jobs to living wage jobs. We need a living wage. We need a universal health care that doesn't go away if we switch employers or we get unemployed. We need there are things we need. We need to not destroy the planet. As I sit here talking to you tonight also, 2 days ago, I heard the news that it was 104 degrees in the Arctic. The North Pole. Santa Claus is on the beach in his bikini at 104 degrees, right? So we need to be thinking about, like, what do the people talking about the sixth mass extinction are talking science. They're not imagining, they're not fear-mongering. We need to change what we're doing. We can do it through organized collective action. We are an oppressed majority in regard to socioeconomic class status. A handful of us make it up into the realms, the upper atmospheric conditions of the super wealthy, and yes, the gold, lavish, coated walls. I'm going to leave the bathrooms out of it. They look lovely. It would be fabulous to be waited on hand and foot day and night. The dream of being one of the super rich is a remarkably pungent, tasty something that calls us all and lets all of them off the hook, but that's not real. The reality is that our middle class has been shrinking. It's been shrinking for decades. And that's what's going on in the United States. We are moving back to that two-class society where we are becoming less and less. We are losing class status. Generations were going up because of labor unions and are being bumped back as they've been disempowered and things have been offshored and, you know, all of that, whatever it is. So wherever you are placed economically tonight, in all probability, if you're listening to me, you're in the 99%, not the 1%. You're probably in the lower 95%. So even if you make $170,000 a year in your household, you know, then blessings on your head, mazel tov, but, you know, you need to be fighting for the rest of us because it's all shrinking down this way. It's all being subsumed up that way. This difference that's been happening between this division between the wealthy and the rest of us is being orchestrated by public policy. And public policy changes when the mass of humanity comes together in an organized collective action demand for change. We need a living wage. We need universal health care. We need absolute debt forgiveness for coronavirus hospitalizations and treatments and testing. We need student loan debt forgiveness. We need at least free community college for all. Other nations, other Western democracies, capitalist democracies, provide these things for their citizens. And when you hear that you have to wait so long in Canada or England for your knee replacement, elective surgeries, you may have to wait, but here you've got to wait till you gather the cash. Often, maybe your knee surgery gets designated and paid for by your health insurance, but there's a whole lot of things that are not covered. Some things I've wanted that are not covered by health insurance because they're considered, you know, completely on you, right? And so in those places, I've had students from England and Canada tell me that they've never ever had to wait to see a doctor for anything and to get treatment, even surgeries for things that were time sensitive in any sort of way. And that anything, you know, yes, they had to schedule something completely elective and something completely non-threatening and not causing them pain and trouble. They could schedule that a few months out. But yes, you know, there is health care. There are ways to do this. And if that upper wealthy percentage of people were paying anything, those corporations aren't paying taxes either. Not only the super wealthy individuals and families, but the super wealthy corporations are not paying taxes in the United States of America to the United States of America, but you are. And you need to go look at your check. And you need to see what percent is being taken off the top of everything you make every time you get paid. And you need to look at that Social Security they're withholding, that unemployment insurance they're withholding, and realize they are not entitlements. I paid in my whole life. My husband paid in his whole life. Anytime we worked, we paid, right? He's been working and paying since he was 12, you know, and literally. And paying in all the way across this space, the generation that's supposed to be so top heavy that they're like, oh good, it's killing the boomers, oh great. That generation paid their entire working lives in an insurance program that the government guaranteed would be there for them. You're not supposed to be paying for your parents and grandparents. You're supposed to be paying for you. They paid for themselves already. If it's not still there, who robbed the cookie jar? Get it together, organize collective action. We stand together. This is our collective fight. Social stratification by socioeconomic class status in the United States, the upper middle class, the lower middle class, the working class, working poor, and the poor. We need to stand together. We are the oppressed majority, and we need it now more than ever. Thank you. Like, subscribe, share. This has been Social Stratification by Socioeconomic Class Status with Dr. Nadine Rosechild-Sullivan.